I have this
I like
song
that
in
you've
my
been
head
adding
all morning.
songs. Welcome back, my friends, to another episode of the Inner Tapestry Series, where we talk about all things cosmic blueprint, earth blueprint, seasonal stuff today, which is one of my absolute favorite conversation topics. So, we're going to be getting into the Wheel of the Year, and for some reason, never happened before on an episode of this show, at least, but I had a card deck leap out, so we're going to pull a card or two at the beginning here, and we're going to talk about holidays, which is like my favorite thing ever, being able to celebrate the earth. So, Red, if you would be so kind, please introduce yourself to our audience.
My name is Red MoonEagle. I am a psychic catalyst, a teacher, and a healer. And the wheel is the cycle that I can't get away from. The wheel of the year is integral to everything that I do. I've tried to live my life in pieces. Like, I'm going to pay attention to the Western societal expectation. I'm going to practice this secretly in the background. That doesn't work. We're just out there now. We're just doing the thing. We're going to
We
talk about
are.
it. I'm so excited.
Yes, and oh my gosh, this is I've been talking recently, so just in case you're not familiar with me, I'm Safrianna and the Queer Spirit Guide, uh, and I'm a visionary CEO, and I have been bringing the wheel through business talks to different summits and professional development events, and it's so exciting because it's starting to click for people like, oh, we're so disconnected from what's happening to the planet. Maybe we maybe we want to change that because we're starting to really feel this profound disconnection. So I'm so excited we're talking about this today. And yes, I have a background in trauma therapy, and I believe we are deeply traumatized in part because of this disconnection from the planet, because the planet herself teaches us compassion and biodiversity and interdependence and growth cycles and rest cycles and all of these things that we need as humans to actually thrive. So this is all like literally my jam, and I'm so glad we're getting into it today. So why is this so important for us to talk about right now? This Angels and Ancestors deck is the one that leapt out to me today and said, you need to pull some cards before you have this conversation. So the first one is snake. Snake medicine is part of
Ooh.
this conversation, and this is all about shedding our old skin. And the old skin has been this disconnect from nature, this removal from the planet herself in the name of more. And the cost of more has been destruction. So this is really about shedding these old skins. Unsurprisingly, Earth Guardian.
Oh my goodness.
Staying rooted and grounded, we're being invited in this conversation to really root and feel our relationship to the planet, because that's what we're talking about today with the Wheel of the Year. The Wheel of the Year is the rhythm of the planet and the seasons where we live. So
Mhm.
there's a difference between northern and southern hemisphere. We're going to probably be talking mostly about the northern hemisphere dates today, but if you're southern hemisphere, some of them just flip based on your season. But Earth Guardian is reminding us to really root where we are and feel that. And then the last one, oh, Red, this has to do with the dark time. It's
Mhm.
this is important to talk about now because we're being called to make plans and focus, because as there is more destruction of the planet and things are getting hotter
Mhm.
and things are getting harder. I mean, most of us have experienced, if you shop in a regular grocery store, that there's sometimes less there right now, that there's crop disruption. That is because we've lost this rhythm with the planet. And
Mhm.
so we're being called to make plans and focus on bringing this healing back to the planet. So, yeah, that all tracks. What do you think?
I think those are the perfect cards, honestly, because, and I'm going to work backwards because, in a certain way, from my own personal experience in life and my own gifts, which are kind of a strange combo. the awareness that I never remember being disconnected from the earth herself. I have no memory in my childhood of ever being disconnected from earth herself. And that's a difficult conversation to have with people when they have the opposite, right? Like they had the disconnection and then they had to learn to have the connection. So when you have this destructive force out in the world that constantly tells you you shouldn't be connected or these things don't matter, um, you we do things that fulfill those. Like I said, I tried following the wheel secretly, right? And still managing to be out in the world and what people think is the way we're supposed to do it in society. And that disconnect created illness in me. It created a disconnection in my own body and illness. I would get sick. The further away from my connection to earth herself, the sicker I got. And we see that as a society. We see that in our motivations for things. I loved how you talk about corporations, money seeking, like all the things out there that we think are important, where we disconnect from our intrinsic connection to the ecosystems in which we live. And our physiological bodies are ecosystems. I love how people, when they get kind of paranoid about parasites, I'm like, you do know that they're good parasites. Like we have to have gut brain biome things anyway.
Yes.
And the collective, if you want to call it that, the pivot to connecting in with the systems, shedding those awful things that don't serve us, that keep us disconnected from, we've talked about it before on the show, like real food versus food like substances, right? Like the things that keep us separate instead of bringing us together. And I don't mean from, I had a conversation with somebody recently. They were like, you sound like a Marxist, socialist, communist, and I was like, oh my God. Okay, I'm going to throw that in the garbage can and I'm going to start over. This is about ecosystems. This is about co-creative spaces in harmonic shadow and light in the world. And talking about the wheel gives us a seasonal, I'm going to use that word loosely, a seasonal wheel to reconnect in with our world. And it can be started very simply. You don't have to dive into the deep end. Safrianna and I are in the deep end. We get it. But you can do some of these things. You can reconnect to the wheel in very simple ways that reconnect your physiological body with the ecosystems in which you live, which then can start that harmonic resonance with the people you're around and help them reconnect. I try to throw away the garbage, right? We're going to detangle the bullshit and just look at what's real, what's possible, what's the connection to you and your physiological body in the world in which you live. Because your physical body is your connection to Earth herself. You are part of that ecosystem. I don't care whether you live in a square box in a high rise in New York City, or you live on a farm out in North Dakota, or you're living in a condo in Arizona, or you're living in Australia in a house in the bush out with the kangaroos. We're all connected to ecosystems and we're all connected to Mother Earth herself.
Yes. Yeah. Brilliantly put. This is the topic, I think, of all the topics that I am most passionate about, because we're at critical mass right now.
Yeah.
Like we have to turn our relationship with the planet around right now. And so we're going to talk about the holidays today. And in that, I want to speak to pleasure activism. Because one of the most important things that we can do on the planet right now is experience more joy, more pleasure, more connection with our communities and our ecosystems and the planet herself.
Yeah.
So that is so important. And we're in this world right now where we have mass technological enmeshment, and our access to information is overwhelming, and they use that information to overwhelm us and make us scared. And then what do? We shut down our pleasure. We feel like we can't have joy. And the suffering
Mhm.
continues. When we're
Yep.
sourced, when we're connected, when we're in gratitude, we have so much more capacity to have a positive ripple effect. So I
Yes.
want to challenge you and encourage you to play with how could these 8 holidays we're going to talk about, even if you don't celebrate them as a holiday or look at them as a holiday, how can you take them as touch points in the year
Mhm.
to connect with nature deliberately, to maybe eat some seasonal food or do a seasonal activity? So we'll try and make sure we're sharing some really fun things to do on
Yes.
these, during these
Fun.
times, because that's what this is about, that pleasure activism and really respecting and appreciating the planet that we all share is really what this
Mhm.
is about. So we're coming up to actually one of the holidays, which is the fall equinox, which is usually between September 20th and the 22nd, depending on the exact time of and date of actual astrological alignment. It's around there.
Yeah.
But right after that is Samhain, which is actually where this conversation kicked off. We were talking about Samhain, and then one of our friends was like, "Oh my gosh, I want to learn more." So thank you for that. And that is Samhain is the transition point in the wheel of the year that starts the new year, sort of.
Yes.
So it's the
Mhm.
death time and the rebirth time. So we're actually going to start with winter, which is technically the first of the days, and then we'll circle back to Samhain so we can get this big picture.
Yeah.
So I'll drop some things in the chat so you can follow along with the
Yeah.
names and all that fun stuff. But
Yeah.
Yule, winter solstice, many people
Mhm.
celebrate Christmas, which a lot of the
Mhm.
traditions in Christmas came from traditional Yule celebrations and things like that. So that's a really
Yes.
fun historical piece. But winter solstice is the longest night. And
Mhm.
in that, it's like the best time to really be with our shadow
Oh
because
yeah.
we're in the stillness, we're in like the den, right? It's this
Mhm.
death and rebirth time. We're really in the
Mhm.
like the womb about to reemerge. So,
Yep.
what are some of your like favorite things about this holiday or day? Like, what do you just love to share about the symbolism of this one?
I think symbolically, I always go back to a story that I did with my kids when they were little because I had little kids, and at Christmas, it's always about Christmas, Christmas, and gifts and all the things. And one of the things that I started from the time my youngest or my oldest, Thor, was right around a year and a half, 2 years old. And that was we would take we turn off all the electricity right before bedtime, and we would light candles. And he loved that. Even at a year and a half, he was like, "Oh, what's this?" And I would tell him stories. I would tell him stories about the birth of the Sun King and the joy of the sun coming back. And just like he was a little boy and he was going to grow and he was going to shine his light in the world, I would tell that in relation to the Sun King story and how Mother Earth herself is connected to all of us. And that represents her giving us a body in this life as spiritual entities. And as he got older, he would add things to the story. He would go, "Well, what about this, Mama?" Like he was so creative. And by the time he was like 5 or 6, he kind of like checked out, but his little brother was participating at that point. But I always did like little felt things, and I'd let him cut them out. We'd make little felt ornaments for the tree. And it was the ritual, it was the ceremony that would connect us. And then because Christmas is such a big thing out in the world, he knew that Santa didn't come on Yule. Santa came on Christmas, right? Came later because Santa is one of the elves, the representations of the fairy folk out in the world. That's how I translated it for him, because I wanted him to know that the ceremony, the joy of Yule itself, was connected to our connection to Earth herself and the plants and the trees and the animals. And one of the parts of the story was also how she puts everybody to sleep in the wintertime. And sometimes
Mhm.
that's also where the older plants die. And that's okay because we have to have the recycle process. Like he learned very early that death was not permanent. And I remember the first time his brother was a little bit older and kind of figured out, he cried. He like bawled. He's like, I don't want the plants to die. You know? And it was it was a joyful thing where both of my boys learned these. I don't know if they remember them now that they're older, but part of that ritual was the connection, the learning about their connection to Earth itself, Earth herself. And it was always like crafts and stories, and we'd sing, and I had these classical CDs of Yuletide music, and we would hum along. We'd make our own lyrics. I remember one year we ended up talking about Bob the Builder digging a hole and planting plants because that was the cartoon at the time, and it was really cool. I didn't write any of it down. We had fun with it. But they understood the separation between the Western, like Santa, and
Mm-hmm.
the purpose of the connection to Yule itself, Earth herself, and the stories
Yeah.
of the shadow and the darkness and kind of the sad things that do happen in wintertime sometimes, and it's okay. It's not a scary thing. It was, it's one of my most joyful memories of Yuletide celebrations with my kids.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And it makes me feel such a part that is just longing for that, beautiful family tradition in that. I'm so glad that you got to share that with your children. It's
Mm-hmm.
just there's so much symbolism to life that if you have kids, you can really weave these stories into a rich tapestry that teaches a lot of life lessons because
Oh
the
yeah.
big thing with this Yule celebration, the winter solstice, is as of the next day, the sun is returning, right? So you
Yeah.
celebrate that longest night, that darkest night, and then it's like now you're on
Mm-hmm.
to celebrating that the sun is returning. And that
Yep.
then leads into the next holiday, which is really the full, we're celebrating the return of the light.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
that's Imulg, and which literally means like use milk, I
Yeah.
believe. And
Something like that.
is I it was one of my favorite holidays to celebrate when I was first learning the Wheel of the Year traditions,
Mm-hmm.
because my baby into the earth-based spiritual world, my first goddess figure that I worked with was Brigid. So
Pretty
Imulg is
good.
also Brigid's day,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of traditions having to do with the figure of Brigid, Saint Brigid in Catholicism, and this is literally also a candle holiday. So in Wicca, it's called
Yep.
Candlemas. So there's a lot of
Yep.
light returning symbolism, and it's really beautiful. And this is where, if you're unfamiliar with the Wheel of the Year, we have our seasonal quarter points. So the winter solstice being kind of the dark point here at the top, if we picture this as winter. And then halfway between winter and spring, we have the cross quarter day of Imulg, which is around February 1st to the 2nd.
Right.
And then we go into another very seasonal one, and then a cross quarter, and then a seasonal one, and a cross quarter. So there's a real flow to it. And you can literally
Mm-hmm.
imagine your quarters. And this also has to do with the wheel and all of
Mm-hmm.
that. So there's much, so much symbolism woven in. But yes,
Mm-hmm.
so Imulg was always one of my favorites to light a ton of candles and just make
Mm-hmm.
a really magical experience. But something that's
Yep.
quieter than Yule. It was never as community focused for me. It was more
Mm-hmm.
about kind of going within and checking in with, what am I really releasing before the spring comes fully back? And what light am I sparking within me? That was
Mm-hmm.
really what it meant to me. And of course, it's a fun holiday. For me, I always do feasts. So I didn't mention, for
Yes.
me, winter solstice, my favorite food is the Sun King soup, which is like this
Oh.
tomato and
Mm-hmm.
orange, bright, sunny energy to represent that Sun
Mm-hmm.
King symbolism. And that is just such a reviving flavor in the middle of winter. But Imulg, associated with that used milk, has a lot
Mm-hmm.
of dairy associations. So this is
Yes.
bread and cheese and like that
Mm-hmm.
heavy, sort of dense winter, like what's still
Right.
stored. So what about you?
You
What do
know,
you
I think it's really interesting on the food thing because when I look at the wheel and I'm looking at the foods for that, one of the things I've always had kind of I chew on in the back of my head, which is what would people have eaten before we had grocery stores? So in bulk has always been very much cheese and bread and like what are the vegetables, what are the foods that would have been stored that are getting to the point where they've been in storage a while, might want to eat them things,
right?
and what is still available in the garden depending on where you are in the world. Like some acclimate places, you're going to have early greens even by that time. And some places, like the farther north you go, it's more pemmican, it's more meats, it's more the stored meats. It's different late season stored foods. And in bulk, when I had kids, because Valentine's Day, a whole different thing, is stuck right there, February 14th, what I would do is I did a countdown. I did a 14-day countdown to in bulk so that when we counted down to in bulk, we would do Valentine's. We would draw the Valentines on that day, and they would get their self-love Valentine. So it was from the year before. They get to pick like what's the thing they love about themselves, and they get to open that the next year. We only did that 4 or 5 years in a row because then things changed in our lives, but it was kind of fun because I remember Thor going, "I didn't say that," and I went, "Yes, but you did." you know, like the reflection as children grow, it's a wonderful opportunity. Again, that self reflection place. That was
Mhm.
one of the things that I did with the kiddos was a countdown because they got to open the I had hearts and they were hearts that were like closed and then the heart opened as you got closer to in bulk and then they could
That's so
open their
cute.
own heart love and then they could create the valentines that they were going to give out because I as a young mom in a world that wasn't very accepting of alternative ways of looking at the wheel.
Right, just the
I
commercial
wanted my
holidays.
right. I wanted my kids to have a connection with that outside world and also kind of understand we are lighting candles and we always did in bulk like later. It wasn't an early day thing. Like it was definitely the evening of in bulk. And then the next day
Mhm.
it was I always did like red things for breakfast the next day after in bulk. I don't know why I did that, but to me it was like the thing
Hmm.
to do. I remember one year we had a roasted deer heart for breakfast, and Thor thought it was like the greatest thing. Taliesin was like, I don't want to eat that.
Did you have a clearly vegetarian child and a clearly whatever child? That's always fun when you
No,
have
I don't think they were. Taliesin was always a pickier eater, so that's a whole different.
that's
I think it's a
fair.
sensory thing. Yeah,
I
and
recently
then
messaged my mom and said, "What did I like when I was really little?" And it's what I eat now. It's so funny. But
yeah.
anyway, yeah.
So going into spring, like the spring solstice or the spring equinox, I always say that wrong. The equinox, it's interesting how Brigid in Imbolc and in the spring equinox,
Yes.
Ostara. I'll just say Ostara because I can't get
Ostara is the and I meant to say this in the chat. I'm sharing the name, like the common name that it's most often known as, but if the name is different in Druidry, I'm also sharing that. So
yeah,
in Druidry, this holiday, for example, is called Albin Eiler.
Bri-
So
yeah,
Albin is like the holidays, those like
yes,
seasonal. It's basically invoking there. This has a change of season here. Just a
yeah.
fun little lore tidbit. But yes, so Ostara is this transition point. Go ahead.
Yeah. And again, if you've got kids, it's the best one to do to connect people's idea of what Easter is, right? Like the
Hmm.
Easter bunny. And the death and rebirth of Christ. And Ostara is an amazing holiday, especially with kids too. I did things like if I had friends with animals, we would go to the animals and we would give them carrots or we would put flowers down where they were. Like I always did like a spring outside thing with my kids because it's about being outside. It's about rebirth. It's about your connection to the rebirth and the awakening of plants, and you're planting the seeds and you're preparing things. And in some places you can't plant anything at Ostara, but boy, you better start your seedlings then. Um,
Yes. The seedling holiday, truly.
yes. The other thing historically that a lot of people don't remember is between Imbolc and Ostara is often where the very destitute in a community would die or be starving because they've run out of food.
Mm.
So there are, in traditional indigenous cultures, there's always food available as long as you have taken care of your connection to the wheel. That's where some of this comes from. So Ostara is not a feast holiday. It's
Mhm.
not a feast where you have a big meal. And yet, in many of the Christian stuff that things get borrowed from, right? Everybody gets together and has a feast. But if you look at some of the early Christian religions, they talk about the fasting at that um, the Easter time, right? They talk about a
Mhm.
fasting and only eating certain things. There's actually a legitimate reason for that. It's the
Yeah.
bridge. It's the bridge. You haven't planted your seedlings. You don't have a harvest yet. You're still making do on the last of what you've got available. So Ostara, when I was working with my kids, and I still do that. Ostara for me is one of my favorite ones because it doesn't have to do with food. It has to do with connection into the thankfulness I have for Earth herself and her animal companions and our connection to the plants and the connection we have to the world herself and the rebirth
Yes.
and the possibilities of our connection through the next of the year. And one of the places I lived when my kids were small, there was a kids rodeo and they got to pet all the lambs and ride the lambs and pet the goats and the sheep and the bunny rabbits. And that was like the thing that we did for like 3 years. They loved it. It was always around the spring equinox, so it always correlated exactly.
Yeah, I my favorite thing to do this time of year, it like at Ostara at the spring equinox is like seed planting rituals, both
Yep.
literally and figuratively.
Oh
So
yeah.
this is when I am like figuring out what we're gardening. If I haven't done the seasonal planning ahead of time, this is like the end of the line, right? You got to do it now. But at least getting the things planted and like starting them indoors. So some literal seed planting, but then this is when I'm back in my business and I'm like dreaming up the new things and I'm making the connections again. I'm reaching out in my network. I'm
Hmm.
touching base with people, right? Because it is that time to start rooting back in. And it's so interesting because, yeah, earlier I was like, oh, I love the food for all the holidays. And you are so right. This is not one that I do a feast for. If anything, I make a potato basket and I do some eggs with like different vegetable fillings. Like that's what I'll
Yep.
do, but that's about it. And that's to get the colorful, because I love that egg painting tradition, right?
Oh
That's like the
yeah.
most
Oh yeah.
fun thing to do. And I'm always like, how can
Hmm.
I do it really naturally? How can I use more
Hmm.
natural materials and dyes and um,
Yeah.
just make the fillings exciting? So using like peas and beets and
Hmm.
turmeric and stuff to make the colors more vibrant. So there's a lot of interesting ways at that holiday to connect into the earth again as she's waking back up from slumber, from hibernation,
Hmm.
and the light is really starting to bloom again. And it's an interesting thing to look at with the equinoxes is that
Hmm.
equal. So the light and the dark are equal, the day and
Yep.
the night are equal, and so
Yep.
they're not at the extreme points of the solstices, they're at the balanced points. So it's really a great time to do like shadow and light work too,
Hmm.
to just
It
bring it
really
all
is.
together and see how
Yep.
are we putting like connecting these two halves of the
Right.
whole so that we can flow and create that fertility, because the next
Yeah.
holiday we're going into is Beltane.
Beltane. Woohoo!
Woo, the sexy holiday.
Fire one.
Yes. So Beltane is one of my I mean, they're all my favorites. That's the
I
thing.
know.
They're all a
They're all my
favorite for a
favorite too.
different reason. But
Yes.
Beltane is so high energy now because we're amping up towards summer. So this is that
Yep.
halfway point between spring and summer. We're
Mhm.
amping the energy up. A lot of people do bonfires, the maypole, right? There's a lot of
Right.
imagery of creation and womb and phallus and all of this coming
Well, and
together.
it's kind of where May baskets come from, right? Like you've planted your seeds, you have your first May flowers, the bees are buzzing. This is where you're getting the pollinators out there, and your seeds are getting pollinated by all the pollinating bugs and stuff. And that's where the May basket tradition comes from, where you pick the Mayflowers and you give Mayflowers. That's where we think of as Mother's Day gets the flowers. It's the honoring of the womb and the birth and the
Right.
like. These celebrations come from someplace. It's not like an ether randomness. And so many times things have been commercialized that people are like, well, I don't believe in the commercial thing, but then they disconnect from the
Right.
earth meaning, our connection to earth herself. And Beltane, I love Beltane. I live in a place where it's like every other year I get to actually do the Beltane thing I like to do. Beltane for my kiddos was like, let's go out and have a walk. Because my Beltane that I like to do is I get outside early in the morning and I get out and I just walk. I sit and have like a picnic basket by myself. Sometimes I take a friend. It depends on what the year is and how muddy it is, because I do live in a place where it can be kind of muddy on May 1st. And I get out. Like Beltane is my time to find the joy connection in nature. It doesn't mean I haven't done hikes earlier in the season, but May 1st is like an intentional time it's for my connection to the fire planet herself.
Mm-hmm.
That fiery
Ooh.
energy, that vitality, that she speaks the loudest, for lack of a better term, at
Yeah.
Beltane and at Samhain to me. That's where her sound, her vibration is the loudest, that says, hey, hey, reach in and connect with me. Connect through
Yeah.
my physical body into her. I love Beltane. It
Oh,
is so
wow.
undervalued.
It is.
Undervalued.
Yeah, for me, of course, is the sexy holiday. It's one of my favorite times to do the magic that takes two people
Yes.
or more, but that's not
Depends.
so much for
Depends.
me, but you do you. Um
Oh, I've done those too. Those ceremonies are amazing.
oh, I'm sure.
Also, apparently, even participating in them, I have been like told this is apparently your like
This is your time.
this is your like celebration.
And yes, it is that, big fire energy. And so
Yep.
I always celebrate it with a bonfire and
Hmm.
not so much the maypole. That's not my jam, but the bonfire is. And yeah, I'm seeing now how Samhain represents like these are the yin and yang holidays.
Yes. Yes, they
That's
are.
they're like slightly they're not even. They're slightly
Nope.
dark and light and, more vice versa, right? And
Yes.
so there is this opportunity to be fully embodied at Beltane and like big energy that in
Yep.
that reverse, Samhain is
Hmm.
the go die, like let
Yeah.
it go, release it, you're in the void. So
Yep.
they're both accessing these really powerful
Oh yeah.
energies, but they're
They're the
complementary
yin and the
opposites.
yang. They
Yeah.
really are the shadow
Wow.
and light of the wheel. And all of them are shadow and light of different aspects. But
Mhm.
Beltane is the one that when I had kids, it wasn't really the one that was the one I involved them and stuff.
Right.
Well,
I
because
love the bees
age,
piece though, right? There's the fertility in
right?
nature that we're seeing. Yes,
They
yes.
learned about it, but it wasn't like Beltane was the one where I found a babysitter
Yeah. Yeah.
because teaching little ones about that aspect is fraught with lots of questions. I mean, bless Thor. As he got older, he was like he knew what was happening. Like he was not a Taliesin was a little bit more oblivious in some things, but it's interesting when you're bringing kids into this and finding the joyful connections with each one of the holidays. there are things that are child appropriate and things that are not child appropriate, and
Yeah.
that's okay. And you can still teach them about things. And this from that Beltane, that high fire, like passion and exuberance for life and connection to earth, and there's just so much at Beltane. I could probably talk about Beltane for a whole hour, honestly. So I will move
We
because I
might
know
do a
we're
class if people are interested in learning deeply
yes,
about each holiday. So let us know because,
because there's everything from kids all the way up to adults in every single one of these. Like there
yes,
is so much.
yes.
Well, going into Litha, Litha is okay. They're all my favorite, but because I was about to say Litha is my favorite because I say that about all of them. But Litha is that high solstice, so that is the longest day of the year, the most sun, and it's my favorite. It's also my dreaded because I have a light. I have like a sun allergy, like
Yep.
legit. I have problems with the heat and the
Yes.
sun. The summer is not my favorite season. But Litha is so important in the wheel because it is that the birth of the sun and then the height of the sun that then leads us into the decline of the sun and the death of the sun. And
Mhm.
so and the solstice, the summer solstice is very much where a lot of people do the solstice ceremonies where you greet the sun or you put out the flame, and there's a lot of like symbolism type thing. I like to do summer solstice where I greet the sun in the morning and I say goodbye to the sun at night. To
Mhm.
me, that is my bracket celebration. I get up on summer solstice before sunrise and I make sure that I greet the sun. It's just something I've done. I make sure I do it. And when I don't do it on the solstice, it feels weird for me. Like for a couple of days, I'm like, I missed something.
Yeah.
And I can, my physiological body, because I'm so attuned to the wheel and I have been for decades, I missed one a couple years ago. And I will tell you that there was something weird going on for a couple days and I could not figure out what was wrong with my body. And then I figured it out, went, oh, I can't go back to the solstice. But boy, I made sure that next morning that I greeted the sun and I did the things that connected me into that sun earth connection
Mhm.
because my physiological body needed the recognition that I am honoring my physiological body's needs in connection to the sun and the earth. They are not separate, they are connected.
Yep.
And that joyful place of that summer solstice is also where I end up doing camping events, usually right around this time of the year. So I'm
Oh.
with community and we stay up late and we're telling stories. And there's, of course, I do SCA stuff. So there's sword fighting and there's games and there's crafting and there's all this community solstice thing.
Mhm.
And that's the part of the solstice. You start seeing it at Beltane with a lot of people, but it's that summer solstice where I want all my friends and one pile so I can enjoy all of our connection to the sun and the earth.
Yeah. I'm thinking about what I do for summer solstice, and yeah, I am often so overheat, like I'm hot, right? And
I'm
so I'm
hot too,
like
yeah.
little bits outside and then back into the shade. And so it's one of those
Hmm.
holidays that's a little bit harder for me
Hmm.
to celebrate like in communion fully with the earth. But this is my favorite time to really seasonally eat all of the fresh fruits that are starting
Oh,
to come
yes.
out, the melons,
Mm,
really making like those summer drinks, right? Like
yes.
having ice, because I'm a person that I don't get to digest raw food very often. Like my digestive system likes cooked food. That's
Hmm.
my blueprint design. And so this is my time to enjoy all of the raw foods and the things
Yes.
coming right out of the garden. Like this is
Hmm.
when we're starting to see if you are gardening, like you're getting those early harvests and it's
Yep.
all of the fresh green leaves
Oh,
and maybe early summer squash and
hmm.
strawberries, like this is strawberry
Beans,
season. Yeah, so there's
beans, and
so many
yeah.
things that are sprouting,
Hmm.
and we're not even quite into the harvest season
Nope.
festivals yet, but we're again amping, the energy is high and the sun has really
Yep.
had its impact.
Mhm.
And, just a little side note here where this year we may have noticed a bigger impact. So, again, reminder, this is why we care and why we want to get us back into the relationship with the
Yeah.
earth. Summer solstice
Well,
should
and
be
it,
enjoyable,
yeah,
not overbearing.
correct. And that's, I think, also why I always end up camping, because there's something about, I am a miserable hot. I do not do heat in camping.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I still go out at the height of summer, and
Yep.
I'm usually camping at that time of the year because it's part of my connection to earth. I
Mm-hmm.
remember camping not very long. It doesn't feel like it's very long ago. I mean, I'm in my fifth decade. So it's not like I'm 100 years old, and it's not like I'm 20 years old and don't remember what happened before. Like, I've got a bridge of experiences that I remember camping at summer solstice, and you'd have a warm day in Montana that was 89 degrees, and that was hot. The last 6 years of camping, we have had 99, 101, 102. I think we had 96 once in the last 5 years. And this is higher elevation up in the part of the mountains where, when I moved to Montana 3 decades ago, apparently, um, it snowed at the summer solstice.
Wow.
Which, by the way, was
Yeah.
epic, and I loved it. Everybody thought I was crazy, and I was like, "Yeah, I get all 4 seasons in one camping event. I love it." But that's like the joy of being able to get out, and I am finding it harder to get out and do
Yeah.
the thing that helps me connect to her, and yet I still do it. It's so important
Yeah.
because I remember a time when you had to wear a hat because of the birds that would poop on your head, not wear a hat because you're going to fry from the sun.
Yeah.
I have that memory. Like, I have that lived experience. I am in my fifth decade. It's not like I'm talking about 200 years ago.
Yeah.
So, our need to be out and connect with the earth, you're not an unusual person where it gets hot and you stay inside because it's so awful outside.
Mm-hmm.
Because more people are doing that instead of realizing, oh, it has changed, and being connected with what those impacts mean, right?
Yeah, it's occurring to me as we're talking more like, yeah, actually every year around this time I do go camping, but it's more
Mm-hmm.
towards my birthday. So my birthday's early June, summer solstice
Yep.
is later June. So I
Yep.
go camping around this time, and I have for these last few years really rooted into like sitting outside in the heat, and
Mm-hmm.
like that's what the planet's experiencing, and I am
Yeah.
part of her. So
Yes.
I think that's as you can build your tolerance. This is one of those things, going back to one of the cards that we first drew today, of focus
Yes.
and make plans,
Focus and make
and
plans.
get rooted and grounded in the earth, like experiencing
Mm-hmm.
what she herself is going through, and
Yes.
staying connected to that, because that gives us more buy-in to
Mm-hmm.
changing it. So
Yep.
anyway, fun little detour detour there. I had to get on that soapbox because it's important. But
Mm-hmm.
Lunasa, which
Oh.
if you've figured out at this point, my name is Safrianna Luna
Uh-huh.
for Lunasa, which
Uh-huh.
Luna literally means autumn. It's my favorite time of year, and actually my favorite time of year. Like, all of the holidays are my favorite, but this is
Mm-hmm.
my favorite time of year, is going into early August and starting to see the later parts of summer fading
Mm-hmm.
slowly towards fall. And it's like, it's apple season, it's early pumpkin season, it's
Mm-hmm.
the not quite leaves changing yet. Like, you're firmly in summer, but you also have this foot in fall,
Mm-hmm.
and we get some of the cooler days. Like, it's just such a beautiful time. And this is when the garden, because this is the first harvest holiday,
Yes.
this is when we're really starting to do our gardening,
Yes.
actually bringing the vegetables in, starting to have way too much to cook. This year
Mm-hmm.
was our patty pans. Like, we were bringing in 4 or 5 patty pan squash a day, and we're like, what do we do
Woo!
with this? We
That's
literally don't
hilarious.
know. We just froze like 13 cups of patty pan.
At
It's
least,
wild.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and Lunasa is also, depending on where you are, I have memories of canning. And canning in August is hot. It's hot. It's like hot, miserable hot. And canning is part of that first harvest. Like you're trying to can as much as you can of that first harvest. And you don't want to lose any of your crop. And depending on where you are in the world, it would have been a different kind of crop or a different kind of thing that you put up. So Lunasa is another one of those. Solstice is a traditional community get together like type thing. And it was often very much like at the height of growing season where you don't really have a lot to do because you're not at harvest, but you've done all the planting. You're just, you know, enjoying the summer basically. And I mean, you did have cows having babies and animals having babies type thing. But at Lunasa is when you have also the big birthing. You know, Lunasa is another community event where, you know, one farmer's got 500 cattle that are having babies, so you go help them, but they're also going to help you have your cattle have babies, and goats are having babies, and this is like also like the sheep having babies, like everybody's having babies. And it's also a community thing. It is the first harvest, but you're harvesting as a community. You're canning together. You're helping with the birth of animals. You also have some birthing of animals in the midsummer, summer solstice. It kind of depends on where you are in the world, but it's a harvest festival where food's involved because you're feeding people, because you're harvesting, you're canning, you're learning together as a community how to put things up and store and um, it you find this particular holiday doesn't show up much in like the Christian calendar, but boy, if you look at some of the traditional indigenous type communities and calendars, you're going to see this pop up every single time.
Mhm.
And it's important. It's such a community connection and Mother Earth connection and thankfulness of life, of produce, of each other, and that shared community
Mhm.
connection. And one of the things that I would always do with the kiddos is it was always right before school, right? Like school started at the end of August, and we would go out and we would do things with other people. Like I didn't make it a ceremonial type holiday celebration at home. That was the one where we went out. Like we were always doing we had dinner with somebody, or we'd go and do a thing, or a round dance, or like wherever we were living, we did things with other people. It was not something that you stayed at home to do by yourself with your nuclear family. It was a connection. And
Yeah.
I do the same thing. I find myself, without even consciously thinking about it, solstice is camping, August is I go out and I do things with other people all the time.
I love that. And this is when you start to really tune into the wheel and see your own relationship with it. You're going to have your own relationship with it. It's going to look a
Yeah.
little different for everybody, but it begins to establish this stable rhythm
Mm-hmm.
that is really good for our nervous systems and our
Oh my
bodies and
gosh.
our spirits and literally everything. And then there's the connection with the planet. Like it's really magical, and it's 8 touch points a year. Like this
Yeah.
is where I really like to remind the modern person, like, tuning in these ways doesn't have to be constant every day, but it can
No.
be, you know, literally quarterly, 8 times a year, when we have a full moon, when we have a new moon. Like you
Mm-hmm.
can layer
Yeah.
in things that work for you. So for me, Lunasa, I think it's so interesting that you go out. This is my Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Lunasa is the holiday that is what America tried to whitewash Thanksgiving into being.
Oh yeah. 100%.
Essentially.
100%.
Ooh, but this is like the really in tune with nature herself, and
Yes.
our families, and potentially our wider communities. And so this is
Yeah.
a time I do like to invite people into my home for a Thanksgiving like meal that's
Yeah.
focused on that first harvest, and
Yep.
people bringing, potluck. Like this is a beautiful potluck
Oh
holiday.
yeah. Yeah.
Probably like the number one best potluck holiday because everybody's got all of this fresh stuff.
Yes.
But yeah,
Farmers markets are big, right? Like you have access to that first harvest.
mm-hmm.
And you're still doing it though, Safriana. You might invite them to your home, but you're still doing that community connection thing. I find that it's this amazing thing when I talk to people who are connected to the wheel and they've all taken their own little pieces. You discover what fits for you. But we're all kind of doing the same thing for the same reasons,
Right.
conscious or unconscious, right?
Yes. Yes. And that's when we're following the rhythm.
Yes,
There is something, I mean, it's the heartbeat of the planet, right? Like we
it
can
is.
all tune into that. And the seasons show us this natural way of living
Mm-hmm.
that's so in tune. So this is the interesting part of the year, the harvest. There's 3 harvest
Yes.
holidays. So the wheel of the year has a lot of interesting relationships. We've looked at the solstices, the equinoxes, the cross quarter days that are in between that. And then we
Mm-hmm.
have like this set of 3 because they're all harvest related here at the end of the year. So
Right.
the end of the wheel is going into the next holiday, which is the fall or autumn equinox, and then the final one, which is Samhain. So we're almost all the way through the wheel. And you've seen a story so far. If you're really like
Right.
paying attention to the flow, we had the light starts to return, the Sun King, the story of the light returning, and then we're lighting the candles to light the way, and we're planting our
Mm-hmm.
seeds, and we're starting to celebrate, and then the sun is high, and this flow, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now we're getting into we're going into more of the slow down, the moving towards hibernation, the really making
Mm-hmm.
sure we're prepared for the year ahead. So
Yep.
this is literally the holiday that as we speak is closest. So it's commonly called Mabon, um,
Mm-hmm.
but the autumn equinox. And
Mm-hmm.
this is like we really start to see the leaves change here, like the beginnings
Mm-hmm.
of that in many places. And the air starts to have a crisp to it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a smell in the air often, I find it this season, like that is distinct, right?
Mm-hmm.
Spring, you're getting those like floral, flowery smells
Mm-hmm.
coming in. Fall, this is like ragweed season. There's a different sort of nuttier, weedier, like grainier smell to it. I guess that's the best way to describe it. Uh,
You know, I think that one of the things I noticed about the fall is that because the plants, and there is a chemical thing, and I read about it years ago. So if anybody knows about it, send us a message and remind me where I read it because it was impactful. It was so impactful to me. And I was really deep into botany at the time for some random reason. And one of the things that happens in the spring chemically with the plants, we're smelling, we're picking that up on. And the same thing is happening in the fall where the trees have gotten their first frost or the it's just getting a little colder and they're like, oh, I have to pull the sap away from the trees and I have to pull it into my trunk and down into the ground to store it, right? And it's the process of starting to go to sleep. It's the process of going into hibernation. And there's a chemical that they release when that happens that we're smelling. There's something about the olfactory senses of human noses with that people forget when they live in a house with chemicals and essential oils and artificial fragrances and fabric softener and fragrance this and fragrance that and fragrance this. We have a superpower nose.
mhm.
And in some ways, our nose is stronger than like dogs and cats in different ways, right? Like it's not the same. It is different. And our strength of that is what is anchoring in our body. We have that ability to smell those subtle changes if we pay attention to it. So you're not
Mhm.
wrong. There is a smell difference. It's actually scientifically proven. I just can't remember what it is. I would love to have backup on this. Anybody who watches this, please help back me up. I know it's a thing.
Well, it makes
I just
sense.
can't.
It does
Yeah.
make sense because there's different processes happening in nature at these different
Hmm.
times. And that is like I think you said something at the very beginning of the conversation where essentially like the wheel is a full year process and it's not. Like we
Correct.
are going through these micro seasons in ourselves all of the time.
Yes.
But if we fail to see the big picture, we fail to see the micro picture. So it's
Yep.
important that we begin to tune back into these really fine little things, and it's sort of like you said, like it doesn't have to be complicated at first as you're dipping your toe in. So maybe the thing you do is you just start to smell the air more and
Yeah.
just see what you notice throughout the year. Maybe that's your little, toe
Yeah.
in, because there's all of
And
these things happening.
and if you can't, what in your olfactory senses in your life is masking it? Because I mean, I'm hypersensitive to smell things.
Me
Like I open the
too.
refrigerator and I can tell you what's going bad in the very back of the refrigerator that everybody's forgotten about from the other side of the room, right? So I'm that person.
I am too.
And not everybody is.
Right.
Um, but what are the things you notice about that fall Mabon, right? Like you really, in most places, you've had some kind of cooling or some kind of frost. And something I want to point out is between Litha and Mabon, that summer solstice and that equinox, is in many parts of our Western world, the Americas, we have fire season.
Mm-hmm.
And that fire season for a lot of people is terrifying.
Yeah.
And it is a cycle, it is a natural cycle. And it's gotten worse because of climate change, right? So when you're looking at that fall equinox and that harvest that happens at fall equinox, this is like your wheat grains, your amaranth grains, your corn grains, like all of your grains. You have some of your first butchering of animals, like what are the animals you're going to cull to start drying meats, and it continues the harvest process. Like how are you putting those things up? It's another community thing. And it's also a part of the time of the year where it's still, you still have hot, right? Like you still have heat, but you have that Christmas that's starting to come in, that change of the season, and you're aware of the shift in your body. I notice at this time of year that I start slowing down a little bit
Mhm.
naturally.
Yep.
I don't notice it so much at Lunasa, but
Mm-mm.
I notice it at Mabon.
Yes.
Mabon is where I start. Actually, for me, it started a little early this year. I made chili last week. Like, for some reason, I was craving chili. Chili is not something usually that I eat during the year until Mabon.
Hmm.
So I thought that was interesting this year. I was like, something's a little odd, but I'm going to go with it. I'm going to trust my body to tell me what it is that it needs. Um, I love like the zucchini bread that comes out of Mabon. For some reason, that's a thing. Or pumpkin bread.
Oh,
Some of like the traditional Thanksgiving foods actually come out of the harvest of Mabon. That is
right.
where those foods come from. I've always been baffled why Thanksgiving is in November. That makes no
Yeah.
sense to
It
me
doesn't.
whatsoever.
Mm-mm.
Hmm.
Me
Hmm.
either. Because it's not like we're literally, doing our garden harvest right now, and it's all of the winter squashes, like the
Yeah.
early winter squashes are coming
Yes.
in. The last of the patty pans are coming in abundance. But yeah, it's
Yep.
like squash, it's gourds, it's some of the hardier leafy vegetables.
Yep.
And we're just now starting. Some of our fall crops are starting to sprout right now, right as
Yes.
we're leading up to this autumn equinox. And it's important to remember, here we're back at that even point
Yes.
where day and night are equivalent, just about. Usually there's that, well, not usually, there's always the point at some point where they're even for that like day.
Yep.
So somewhere between the 20th and the 23rd usually. But yeah, this is yet another, this is feast season, all the harvest, like really celebrating what's there, and having that be that connection time. This holiday really feels still gratitude, but there's something more about the early harvest that feels gratitude-y to me, but there is more
Hmm.
of that preparatory energy. It's
It's
like we
preparation.
are
Yes.
winding down for what's coming next, which is the death.
Yeah.
And so there can be a really, really i- important rooting here, like rooting and
Yeah. You're
grounding down
rooting
for
in
winter.
and you're slowing down. And when I bring the Ostara awareness, like Ostara is not a feasty holiday, but
Hmm.
Mabon is, right?
Yeah.
Like you have, again, that shadow and light. And people get confused when I say the light of the feast of Mabon and the shadow of the not feast of Ostara, but Ostara is in the spring, so people think of the light versus the shadow of Mabon. Like, it's one of those things in the wheel where I find that there is an equitable tipping point at both ends of the equinoxes. Like, I can see the shadow and light in each.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it throws people when I throw that out there, and I'm like, but I can feel it in my body. I can feel that. The thing that I did with my kids at both ends was the balancing the egg activity. That was Thor's thing. He was like, when are we going to balance the egg? And then when Thor went away to go to school that fall, Taliesin was like, are we going to balance the egg this year? And so we balanced the egg. And then in spring, he goes, don't we balance an egg now? Like, he was ready to balance that egg. Like, he didn't know why sometimes. He was like, what is this for? But we're going to balance the egg, right? Like,
So cute. I love these traditions.
yeah. They're simple and they're full of joy, right? They just make you giggle, right? Like, can you imagine a little kid coming up to you and going, when is the egg balancing day?
I can imagine a little kid like asking like a stranger, "Oh, when is the egg balancing day? It's got to be soon." And this person being like, "You're bonkers, kid." But
Right?
yeah, that's so cute. Yeah, there is something I'm noticing this year since we are here right now, that similar slowdown. And I've really rooted into the wheel over this last year. And the year before that, I was teaching it publicly, and I literally had a holiday where people could sign up. And then this last year, I did it all for myself and not professionally. And both years just deepened me into it more. And
Yep.
now this year, I'm, still on the doing it for me, and everything's like slow down, do less. Slow down and do
Yep.
less. Be grateful for what you've harvested. And we don't need to do more than that. It's really like a
Nope.
balancing, a rebalancing time. So we're leading up to this holiday coming right up. And then on the tail end of that, we have the quote unquote witches' new year, the end, the turning point with Samhain. And it totally, everyone, when they read it, they're like, Samhain? Don't worry, I was there too.
I did
But
too.
yes,
I did too.
we all butcher this one, but Samhain is the pronunciation of this one, and it is Halloween. Like most people know, it is Halloween. It's it's spooky season for a good reason. Like there really is some symbolism there because this is the veil. If you believe in the veil between worlds, like it's thinnest, and people will have connections with ancestors all of a sudden,
Hmm.
or they'll feel called to a loved one that's passed, or just this like going within, like I need to go into
Yep.
the dark to connect with spirit somehow. And so
Yes.
really it evokes this sense of magic in a way that a lot of the other days are, they're great festivals of nature, but this is
Yep.
like nature and supernatural almost have a marriage here in a very fun way.
I love how you bring that in. It was, one of the things that, all kids love Halloween, right? They dress up. And I definitely did that with my kids. And there was always a place with this where I tried it kind of like the Imbolc calendar, right? Like, I discovered that and I went, oh, that worked really well. So I tried it with Samhain. It didn't work as well. And I kind of understand why, because I should have done the other direction where it goes from Samhain to solstice. And I didn't think of it at the time, but years later, I'm like, oh, that would have been a more epic way to do that. But you learn, right? And Samhain for me is that, just like Beltane is like that, rrr, Samhain also has a rrr to it. There's a fire to it, but it's like the Ostara and the Mabon, where it's Beltane and Samhain also have that flip of that shadow light in a way that you don't. It's kind of philosophical and metaphysical and spiritual in this big way, and yet very, very applicable in the minutia of you, your person.
Hmm.
And Day of the Dead, everybody knows about Day of the Dead. That is Samhain. Like it's represented in the world in so many indigenous cultures across the globe because we feel it. Our physiological bodies feel that veil thinning. We feel that constant connection to birth and death in our bodies. And I don't know if it's just women because we have the potential to take and produce life. I'm not sure. But Samhain has always been the one where I reverently treat Samhain as a reverent, deeply spiritual, earth herself connection. There's candles involved, there's ritual involved. Samhain is, of all of the ones that I do, Samhain is the one that gets the ritual. If I skip one in the wheel, Samhain's the one I do not miss.
Right.
Samhain
Same.
is lighting the candles in the darkness and staying up till midnight, the witching hour, and making sure I give space to honor my ancestors that genetically over generations produced this meat suit, right? I give honor to that. I give honor to my children and their children's children, wherever that line will go. I give honor to Earth herself and the generations that produce the trees and the plants and the foods. And it is also the traditional time where if you wanted to protect your animals that you wanted to have survive through the winter, you would drive them through the Samhain fires. So the twin or triplicate, depending on where you were in the world, you would build these bonfires, you would throw herbs and scented things into it. Ironically, also had a purpose. You drive the animals through that and it would debug them so that when you put the cow in your house, because you're living with your animals at that point of time, you didn't have bed bugs and fleas as early in the season, right? Like people were not dirty. People knew how to be clean. I can't say that enough. People think, oh, my ancestors were dirty. We wouldn't survive if that was the case, just FYI.
Yeah, exactly.
So like there was a method to the madness, I guess, is what we think these things are weird, but they had a purpose. And I look at honoring my animal companions this time of year. You know, like if you look at some of the kind of quirky, witchy, pagany type things, you see the witch with her cat, right? Like there's a reason for that. It's not a random representation. It's supposed to show you the connection that you have with your animal companions at this time of the year, because that's why it's not why we hunt in the fall, but hunting season is this time of the year too, where you go out and you connect. In theory, you're doing it in an ethical, mindful way. You connect with the animal, you let the animal itself tell you whether or not it's willing to sacrifice itself, and then you honor that process. Now, you're a vegetarian, I am a meat eater, and me being a meat eater means I have to be more intentional about what it is I'm eating because I recognize the connection between that animal sacrifice and my meat suit. And Samhain is, of all of the ones I do, that is the one I am. There's a word religious in my vocabulary, which isn't really much. That is the one. I do the ceremony at Samhain to acknowledge the sacrifice of all living beings of the past and into the future that make today possible and make this reality a possibility. And I find joy in that. I always pull out the cards and light the fancy candles and pull out all the little fun things I've collected over the years to make this a beautiful ceremony.
Yes.
And when my kids were small, this was always the fun part, is we would do this after trick-or-treating. It was the one night of the year that it didn't matter. They got to stay up late, right? Because part of the ceremony for the kids was the sacrifice. So they would sacrifice a piece of candy to the fire. Like sometimes it's just a bowl or whatever, right? I'm not going to have a bonfire with a 2-year-old. It's just not happening. But they would do a sacrifice, and it was something to honor. It was a sacrifice of honor, and it was always done willingly. I didn't pick the candy piece, and it was so funny because between the two boys, Thor would think about it. He'd go, I don't know what feels, I really like this kind of candy, but to have a real sacrifice, I have to give up something I like. And, he had to think about it and kind of work his way through it. Taliesin was like, oh, this is my favorite piece. The fire can have that. There was no thinking. It was just doing. He just did the thing. And I was, yeah, kids are amazing.
Kids are so, you see, and I know, like, those threads of their nature coming through. And that's, how we associate with holidays and celebrations, I think really brings us back home to ourselves when we're allowed to do that. And because that's the intention of ritual. And I want to share here, one, I want to share my favorite ritual for this holiday, but I also want to say something that was recently shared with me in a sister circle, which is that ritual doesn't have to be precious, right? So Samhain is where I'm likely to do it up if I'm going to do it up. Also Yule, just because decoration for Yule is very fun. I love lights. But a lot of my rituals in this past year have just been honoring in a meal or honoring and going out in nature in some capacity. So it doesn't have to be complex, but Samhain is when I like to connect with the ancestors as well. It's that is the time. And I like to do the dumb supper ritual, which is literally a silent dinner. So essentially you can do it on your own, but I usually do it in a small group, and the youngest person I think we usually serve the youngest person last.
Yes. That's usually how it's done.
And then the host is served truly last. And then you have the meal, and you set the table for your ancestors. So I usually light like little tea lights, and I write my ancestors' names on slips of paper and have a seat at the table. The head of the table belongs to them. And one of my favorite stories with this ritual is one year I don't like pie crusts. For whatever reason, that crunchy on like a pumpkin pie crust, it's the texture on my teeth or something. I just can't. And my grandmother was the same way. And this was one of the first years that I had done the dumb supper ritual, and I honored my grandmother. And at the end of the night, I put some of my leftovers outside and the plates that belong to the ancestors outside for the energy to be dissipated or critters to eat them or whatever. Yeah. So the next day we came out, and I looked on the back porch, and this plate had been completely neatly eaten. There was no mess. Nothing was tipped over. Even the glass was empty because I put some cider out. But the only thing that remained was the pie crust.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, woo, we're jazzed up now. Like, that was probably one of the weirdest and most magical experiences of my life, because I'm like, if that was a raccoon that ate that, the raccoon would have taken the pie crust or like crumbled it or something, but it was literally that little piece of pie crust. Like, no thanks. So it's a wonderful time to play again with that magic of just being alive, and the connection that we are alive because of the people that came before us. And so this is then that kickoff point. Again, we celebrate Samhain, and then the wheel starts again. We're now moving, we're counting down towards that winter where the light is going to begin to return. Yeah. But this is the dark chapter.
And the other piece is Samhain is 2 days. And that's the part that out in the world, I've always had to really kind of be kind of firm about. Like, I'm not just working October 31st. I will also not work November 1st.
Yep.
Because it's the connection into the depth of that darkness. And one of the things that I've done for a really long time is, I might put the kids to bed when they were younger, but as I've gotten older, Samhain is the time that I stay up till midnight. Like, I really delve into the depths of the darkness, the witching hour, right? And then I honor my body the next day. I really honor the gift of that life, that sacrifice, that darkness, that turning point, that connection. Because depending on what year it is, and I've had some very interesting Samhains, kind of like you had with the dumb supper, like, it's kind of okay, here's your message. And then you sleep because you're like, or maybe you don't sleep. I've actually had Samhains where I didn't sleep. That's always a very interesting next day, right? But then I'll sleep. Like I'll take a nap, and then all of that will congeal in. There's something about how that experience comes into the body that next day after a sleep. And that is where you will notice it. If you just do one little thing, you will notice that your body shifts at Samhain. There's a reason why our ancestors celebrated this last piece of the year in a very specific way, depending on your indigenous ancestry, your cultural ancestry. And I've got a little bit from around the world, so I've got different things pulling at me. But the one thing that comes together always in my genetic makeup, all the little pieces of my ancestors that come together, is Samhain.
Yeah.
If I miss all the others, Samhain is the one that brings me back to center.
Yes.
And I have to throw this out there because I think it's hilarious. So I did a full year of daily devotions where I followed the wheel of the year. I followed the Samhain to solstice and solstice to Imbolc, and I was very rigid with it, right? I really stuck to it because it was easy, right? It was easy. And then this last year, I've done the solstice to equinox, equinox to solstice, solstice to equinox. And I have had one hell of a time holding on to it this last year. And it was actually the conversation we had about talking about the wheel for the podcast that I sat with it. And I realized, oh, hey, Red, get a clue. You're supposed to be following the wheel that connects people in community. And that is the full, because if you look at it, your Samhain to Imbolc, Samhain to solstice, solstice to Imbolc, those are your peopling. Mm-hmm. Those are your peopling. And the world itself, why we're talking about Wheel of the Year, we're talking about reconnecting with the earth and the cycles in a simple way, in a connected way, so that we can fix, so we can start really being equitable and fixing and looking at the processes, not from a money grubbing outside weird toxic
capitalist.
Get rid of that.
Capitalist.
Get rid of it. Like we're the dark time has happened. We have to now come it back into the light, for lack of a better term, more equitability, more shadow light balance. And to do that, I myself, with my daily devotions, that was one of the reasons I started daily devotions, was to connect with people. Mm-hmm. And I did it with the wheel process. And then I tried to do it with a different part of the wheel process, which is not in alignment. And I went, wow, I could have gotten a clue like 8 months ago. Why am I okay, fixing the problem.
Yeah, this is why the pattern mastery is an important part, and it takes time. Yeah. You can't figure out your flow for the wheel in a month, because the wheel encompasses all of our seasons, all of the months in the flow. So there's it's like, that's why I keep saying you can begin to practice this with the moon, the tuning in, because it's a more immediate turnaround.
Oh yeah.
Or you can also expand into the seasons, or you can expand into the seasons where it takes weeks for you to start to notice something shifting. And that's part of the playing with your patterns, your pattern mastery. Mm-hmm. So hopefully this, gave people some ideas. I love that we brought in, activities for adults, activities for kids, and really this well-rounded view of this, because if even 30% of people were doing more seasonally based living, we'd start to see a huge shift. So I think it is becoming more accessible, but we don't want it to swing down that commercialized end of the spectrum either. This is about honoring. This is about flowing. This is about connecting. Mm-hmm. It's not about buying. It's not about doing. It's not about showing off. I've been to some rituals that are just about showing off, and I'm like, ooh, these don't feel good.
Well, and the other side of it, if you think of where Thanksgiving is in our modern culture, how many people, random question, do you know that have huge trauma around Thanksgiving? It's in the wrong. It's in the wrong time of the wheel. You can't honor a true Thanksgiving when you're out of cycle. You're forcing something that isn't in alignment with our physiological connections to Earth herself. There is nothing good about the Thanksgiving of what we've created as a Western society. There's nothing healthy about it. And I refuse to celebrate. I've kind of gotten more and more refusey-ish in the last, ever since the dark time hit. Once the dark time hit, it's been this resistance, and it's just gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. Like, no,
Yep.
I will not participate because it's out of alignment with the natural cycles of our physiological bodies in with Mother Earth.
Yeah.
Why? Why? Stop. Just stop.
So, with all holidays, I encourage people to use them as opportunities to connect in with what's actually happening in the world, to
Yes.
connect with real people and have
Mm-hmm.
real, meaningful connections, and also to use what we have. Right?
Yes.
This is an opportunity to use what you have. You don't have to buy new decorations. You don't have to buy decorations at all. You can go outside and get leaves
No.
off of the ground or a pumpkin from your
Yes.
garden or like whatever. But connecting in
Mm-hmm.
with what you have and what you can access locally is a great place
Mm-hmm.
to start if you want to use these as touch points. And again, if you're interested in learning more about the specific holidays, it could be something Red and I provide in the future. Who
Yeah.
knows? I've been practicing Wheel of the Year ritual for about, gosh, there's no way it's 17 years. I can't math, but that also seems way too big, but I think it's accurate. And it changed my relationship with myself when it began and has continued to deepen more and more as I unhook from dominant societal expectations of how we're supposed to live and buy and like always be striving for more versus the honoring of what is, the honoring of our nature and Mother Nature, as well
Yes.
as just the actual reality of what's happening around us. So if you have follow-up questions, let us know. Otherwise, I think this was a beautiful conversation. I learned a little bit. I hope you learned something new too. And if you are watching, whether live or in the replay, let us know how we can support and if there's a topic you'd like us to
Yeah.
cover in the future.
Yeah. Because Wheel of the Year is something that I'm glad it came up the way it did, Safrianna, because it's one of those things that I don't conscientiously think I need to explain because I've done it my whole life in one way or
Yeah.
the other, whether I was hiding behind cultural expectations, but it's been there my whole life. So 5-ish decades ish, somewhere right around there, that I've just done the things. When we have a question that comes from one of our friends that says, "Hey, I don't know about that thing," I go, "How do you not? How do you? Oh, I have to explain that." So if you out in the audience watching the replay or you've watched this with us, please ask questions because I don't know what you don't know. And
Yep.
I want to share it
Same.
all. I want to share it all.
Yeah, you should have seen us when we got this like idea for this podcast. We were both like happy dancing because we're like, yay, let's talk about it. Because it's one of my favorite things to share with people. And, it's one of my favorite things that I've been able to share with the people I'm in relationships with and my friends.
Yes.
Like, for many years, it was inviting friends into my household to celebrate a holiday they'd
Yeah.
never celebrated before.
Yes.
And to just get us connected with a meal and maybe an activity and the earth and each other, and it's really
Yeah.
beautiful. So I hope this is inspiring to someone out there to try something new and connect with
Mhm.
themselves and their community and the planet in a new way. And yeah, we're here. So until